Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 20 Favorite TV Shows of All Time. This video is a Patreon requested video requested by patron Ricky. Ricky, thanks so much for your suggestion. However, you sure don't make it easy for me. So in this video, I will attempt to compile my 20 favorite shows, that is TV shows, streaming shows, whatnot, of all time. So my favorite ones. And Ricky did, when they made this request, pointed out that it was different than the video I already done, which was a top 20 favorite sci-fi shows of all time, which I'd done a few years back. And because this will be more inclusive to all shows, not just sci-fi fantasy. And also, my opinion since that video has changed, as so even some of the shows within that list itself has sort of changed position since then. And so, yeah, this is really hard to do. Now, what I sort of decided when I was making this top 20 is that I would have to take the entire show into account, which is actually very different from what I've done before with like my top 10 favorite seasons of television of all time, or my top 10 favorite episodes of all time, because then I could hyper focus on a specific aspect of the show. But for top 20 favorite shows of all time, I decided I would have to take the entire show into account. So if there were some bad seasons, then I would have to consider those bad seasons if there were some bad episodes, or if they did a bad storyline, whatever. So I was trying to look at the show as a whole, and sometimes it is difficult to compare apples and oranges, because I had decided to include some limited series shows as well, so some shows that only ran for one season. And so it is really apples and oranges when I'm comparing a 7-season show that did like 25 episodes per season, so had like 176 episodes in total, and comparing that to a 1-season modern show that had 8 episodes in total. It is kind of apples and oranges, but I think these limited series shows should be eligible, because they wouldn't be eligible for a movie list, and I'm not going to do just a limited series list, and even if I did, that's a very small pool. So I think they deserved to be included in this, because they're also shows. So I just had to, basically, if a show did it, so it does strike it against these longer running shows, because there's more opportunity for them to have bad episodes or bad seasons. But I'll also try to take into account if these longer running shows did have higher highs and overall average more highs than the show that was only on for 8 episodes, then I would also consider that and try not to hold the bad stuff too much against them. So there's a lot of sort of rounding up, and I'm not sure how good of a job I did, and I'm sure that maybe I forgot a show or two. I think that is a strong possibility, and maybe I'll change my mind. I bet you if I made this list a year from now, it would be totally different than it is, or mostly different than it is right now. Even if I made this list like a couple of months from now, it would probably be pretty different. So it changes day to day. But, did the best with that I could to try to comprise a top 20 list, and try to be as fair as I could to each show, and consider the entirety of it and how much I love it. And if a show does have really high highs but also low lows, but there's another show that has some highs but not that high, but don't have any low lows, I would still probably favor the one with high highs, even though it does have more low lows, because if it hits a higher point, then that's sort of more impressive to me. But anyway, I will say, for the most part, I have excluded shows that are still running, particularly those that had just started, that only have like one season or something. I'm particularly thinking of something like House of the Dragon, or one of those more modern day shows that just started. I've decided to just exclude them entirely because they not that far through the run, and so they have a story to tell, and they barely started to tell the story, so I feel like I can't really judge those particular shows, which is different from a one-season run because they have one season to tell, and they tell it the whole story in one season, which is different from a show that's supposed to go like 4 or 5 seasons and has only been on for one so far. There is one exception I make for a show that is on this list that is still running, but it's been running for 5 seasons, and so I feel like that's long enough for it, so I made the exception there. The other thing I should mention is, as most of my lists do, I will favor more modern shows, and I did consider all shows that I watched throughout, the history of time, but the truth is I just prefer the modern form of storytelling better. I think this is the golden age of TV, and so this will skew more towards the modern shows. So if you're expecting a lot of 60s, 70s, or 80s show, or even 90s shows, you will be a bit disappointed. But anywho, let me go ahead and get started with my top 20 favorite shows of all time. My number 20 on my list is Mr. Robot. So Mr. Robot had a fairly strong first season, kind of weak second season that meandered a bit, an amazing third season, and a somewhat okay fourth season that had a disappointing ending. So that kind of held it back a bit, that it only had one really great season, but and that the second season meandered a bit, and of course having a disappointing ending does strike a bit against it. But the style of this show I thought was amazing, even throughout the bad seasons. The cinematography, the acting, the just the editing, the whole way. It has some of the best sort of stylized moments. I think the story did a little bit fall apart in the final season, but the style of the show is still something to appreciate. So it still made my list at number 20. So next we'll get into number 19 on my list, which is House MD. Now this is the only sort of procedural network show that you'll find on my list, where it basically the plot of every episode is pretty much exactly the same, which is what you have with a lot of hospital dramas and cop shows, and like CSI and stuff like that. And so I typically don't like those kind of shows. And I do find that's definitely the case for House in its first 3 seasons, that it's very formulaic. But I make an exception for House because the character of House is a very interesting, very witty character, very entertaining character to watch, and the other characters that he interacts with are very, fascinating. So it's very great to see the interactions. But the larger point is that I think even though it's stuck to this procedural format for the majority of its run, in the later seasons, particularly season 4, it started to go outside its format and go a bit more character-based and tell a lot of long-term storytelling with these characters, which I thought were amazing. So I got really immersed with the characters towards the end of the series run, and then I had a season 7, which dealt with a breakup, which I actually thought was one of the best, most realistic, or most relatable to me examples of how rough it is to go through a breakup. And so that was a very personal sort of season for me as well. So overall, I just thought that the characters were shine through its procedural format, where I think there's a meme online that has a form that can tell what exactly every single episode is exactly the same, but still a great show to watch. So next it would be number 18 on my list, which is The Watchmen. So this is one of those limited series shows that only ran for 1 season. I really feel like it should have been called like something else, like The Watchmen some subtitle because it's not the same thing as The Watchmen. It doesn't tell the same story that the comic book or the movie based off the comic book did. In fact, it is, by all accounts, a sequel to the comic book and ignoring the movie. And I was blown away by this show. I did not expect much from this show. I was kind of sick of superhero shows, especially DC ones. And I was never that big of a fan of The Watchmen. But this dealt with racism and a lot of other potent issues, and also had really interesting, great characters, but also really great mysteries that really kept you engaged. And the way it delved deep into these characters and the mysteries was a super impressive. Now, I will admit I was held back a bit because I wished it would have been more than one season. I thought the ending of the show was kind of pretentious, and I would have liked to have seen more seasons. But, and I did think the finale was lacking a bit and wasn't as satisfying as I hoped, but it was still a fascinating ride, and it was still great characters, and it was still a huge standout show. So, next on my list is number 17, which is Westworld. Now, I will maintain to my dying breath that season 1 of Westworld is the most overrated season of all time. But I still liked it, even though it was not nearly as good as everyone else makes it out to be. It was okay. It did have a lot of issues. It was too slow at the start. A lot of the villains were two-dimensional, and a lot of the characters were two-dimensional. But it had some strong moments throughout, particularly with the hosts coming to realize who they actually are. But season 2, it definitely did get better, even though it got more weird, which turned a lot of people off. I think it actually got a lot better, more complex. I like the non-linear storytelling. And then season 3 was a masterpiece, and then the main reason why the show is this high on this list, because I still think season 3 is a cyberpunk masterpiece. I fucking love it. I think it definitely way improved from the first 2 seasons. But then again, season 4 was kind of a step down as well. There were some great moments, some great twists, really spooky moments. I wasn't a big fan of the ending. I thought that the final couple episodes were kind of a letdown, and now that the show is canceled as the ending for the show, which I think is not a good ending for the show. In fact, had the show just ended at season 3, it probably would have been higher on my list, because I thought that would have been a better ending for the show as a whole. So it kind of has a kind of pretentious, kind of bad taste in my mouth ending now, but still an amazing show, and it still has to be up here because season 3 was just a masterpiece. So next we will get onto my list is number 16, which is Battlestar Galactica. So this show I really loved. It had great characters, great action sequences. The suspense in it was tangible about the group of human beings fleeing from utter destruction and who are constantly being hunted by artificial life forms that are trying to wipe them out. And then it delves into these artificial life forms and what their meaning of life is. And so it's really fascinating, really interesting. Now, I think season 1 and 2 were really suspenseful, really good, but they did meander sometimes. Season 3 is when the show had a step back for me. The whole being on that colony thing I thought was kind of a waste of time. And then it got into some of their weird prophecies and stuff, which season 4 kind of delivered on. Like, I think the ending of Battlestar Galactica was good and not great, though. I think the ending could have been better. It was somewhat satisfying. At least didn't totally suck, but it wasn't the best nor the worst ending ever. So I can't rate this show super highly. And plus, about the fact that I do believe this show was a lot of times trying way too hard to be edgy. Like, look at how edgy we are. Or look at this. This is so edgy. Oh my God, this is so edgy. What a moral dilemma. We're so edgy. And sometimes it was like, okay, that's enough. Just bring it down a bit. But I still love the show. Still had amazing characters. Still was super intense and still had me engaged throughout. So that is number 16 on my list. So next we will get into number 15 on my list, which is Star Trek Voyager. So Voyager had an amazing premise, which by all accounts did not live to its full potential of its premise. It would be much higher on my list if it had, but it still had a lot of amazing episodes, a lot of great. I think the foundation was there, the characters were there. I think the first two seasons were really strong because you had this sense of community, this sense of the ship being lost in space and how they dealt with meeting all these strange aliens and creatures and everything like that. Third season had a lot of writing issues. The third season was terrible. Season 4 was amazing. It recovered with the introduction of the Borg with 709, an amazing character, delved into her in an amazing way, and had some of the best episodes of all the entire Star Trek franchise. But then you had season 5, 6, and 7, which progressively got more and more mediocre until season 7, which was extremely mediocre, leading to one of the worst series finales of all time, or the worst series finale of all time. Sorry, I should clarify. So those last 3 seasons do definitely bring it down, but they weren't terrible. They were still good, amazing episodes even within those 3 seasons. And of course, when the show was good, it was really good. So I know a lot of people would disagree with me putting this high in this list, but I still like Voyager despite the fact it didn't live to its full potential, despite the fact it could have been better than it was. It was still good, and it still had a lot of really strong pieces to it. So that is number 15 on my list. So next we will get into number 14 on my list, which is sadly Game of Thrones. I still have to put this in my top 20 because it's still an amazing show. It still has some of the best writing, acting, cinematography, storytelling ever put on any kind of screen ever. But of course, problem is those last 2 seasons. Now, if I was just judging the show from seasons 1 through 6, this would easily be my top 3 favorite shows of all time. But I'm not. I have to include the entire show, as I said, and unfortunately those last 2 seasons do bring it down quite a bit. They were terrible seasons. I think this is easily the worst ending of any show ever, the worst final season. And it did hurt it a lot, especially because those first 6 seasons, which were really good, were building towards something. They were setting up this greater story. They were leading to something, and because what it leads to is a bunch of nonsense that doesn't work, that hurts even those good seasons. It's hard for me to go back and watch the show even when it was good, now knowing that where this is all leading to is just something really terrible that's really poor quality of writing. But that being said, it was still amazing. It was my favorite show for a while before it got bad. And I believe, when I did my top 20 sci-fi fantasy shows of all time, I think this was number 1 because it was before the bad seasons came. And as I said, if I could just exclude those 2 final seasons, this would easily be my top 3. And if the show got a actual good ending, this would easily be my number 1, very easily. But because of those terrible seasons, this only comes in at number 14. But the strength of Tyrion and all the characters and the dynamics and the complexities of the world still give it a spot on my top 20. So coming in next at my number 13 is the show Narcos from Netflix. I think this is probably, if I compare it to a lot of auto or biography of what I call them, biopics, I'll just say that, of famous criminals, mobsters, gangsters. This is probably my favorite, and comparing it to even movies, I would put this above a lot of other movies as a great crime drama. It tells the first two seasons tell the story of Pablo Escobar, and then the third season, which I still love the third season, tells the story of the Cali cartel. So I think the way it's shot, the way it's told, was amazing. They played fast and loose with the actual accounts a little bit, but they stayed true to it in the important parts. And the way they were able to tell the stories was absolutely engaging, absolutely fascinating. I was more engrossed in this, as I said, than most other sort of crime biopics. So I definitely had to include this on my list. So next we'll get into number 12, which is Dark. Another Netflix show, but this one definitely a lot more fantastical. So this dealt with time travel, and in a very unique way, and in fact super complex way. I was like super impressed with how they managed to have such a complex show with so many ins and outs and so many different variables that all connect, all make sense, because a lot of time travel shows and movies fail because they get their time travel logic wrong. They make some flaws, mistakes, some things don't add up, they don't explain themselves very well, but this one was very intricate and connected all perfectly, and also had very fascinating characters, very interesting characters to tell, and very, very complex journeys. Now, I will say that I think the show did get a bit too complex, especially in its final season. They introduced the storyline with the other world, which I think actually made the show too complex and sort of too overbearing, and I wish they would have just brought it back a bit. But that being said, the ending that they had was amazing. It was a great way to end the show and round everything up and make everything make sense. So it was still overall an amazing show. And the first two seasons, especially the second season, which was quite good, definitely were a highlight of the show. So that is number 12 on my list. Next is number 11 on my list, and that is Lost. Now, Lost, similar to Game of Thrones, suffers from a bad ending, but hear me out here. I actually don't think the ending is as bad as the Game of Thrones ending, but it definitely is not as good as it could have been. And again, Lost is something that's all leading up. It's building towards like this big ending that actually turns out to be not very good. But this, I think actually I have an easier time going back and watching the earlier episodes of Lost, even knowing the bad ending that it's leading to, because it still is one of the most rich character exploration shows there ever was. The way it explores every character's backstory and ties it into the main plot of a storyline. Now, granted, season 1 I think did meander a bit and was a bit sort of too slow paced. Season 2 I think was the highlight of the show, was what the show should have stayed, that feeling it should have kept throughout the entire show, even though not every episode was great. It did meander at times. Season 3, the writers definitely apparently purposely were, delaying it just to say, hey, this is so bad it could get, because we need an end date, because the networks wouldn't give them an end date, so they purposely meandered, but it had an amazing ending. So overall, still love season 3. Season 4, a lot shorter, more succinct, and in a lot of ways better, but I think this is when the show started to lose the feeling, the main purpose of the show that has established in season 2. And then season 5 had a really great start, but then halfway through just went really downhill, and leading up to season 6, which was really bad, and I had a really terrible ending that just did not service the characters nor the story. Even though the writers insisted service, the characters absolutely did not. And it was just not a good ending for the show. But those first 4.5 seasons were still so great. I'd never been as engaged, as enveloped. Like, I was on bated breath waiting for every episode. Like, I think the only other experience I had with the show like this is Game of Thrones. And again, similar issue with the ending. But yeah, it's just, I still think it has some of the best quality in storytelling ever seen on any screen. So that is my number 11. So next we'll get into my number 10, which is Dope Sick. Now, this is one of those limited series shows I was talking about, and when I really considered this, I really had to realize that this is one of my favorite shows, that it tells the story of the opioid crisis, but it does so by examining a lot of different characters, different aspects. You see the billionaires who create the drug, you see a small country doctor, you see a lawyer trying to prosecute it, you see a DEA agent trying to deal with the crisis that's prevented, you see a young person who is an addict, and it really does such an amazing job of exploring each of these stories and each of these characters, and I particularly love the non-linear storytelling. I think this is one of the best uses of non-linear storytelling, and if I'm being honest, this is probably the main reason why it's got as high on my list as it was, because I think you couldn't really, some people complained about this, which I totally disagree with, because you couldn't tell this story because some of the storylines were taking place in 2014, others 2009, and if you told it in a linear fashion, it just wouldn't work, because you would just be in one storyline and move to the next. I think it works so much better by intercutting them and intercutting the different timelines, and the way they did it, I think, was brilliant. I think it's some of the best writing, editing I've ever seen, and so that's why I had to put it up at my number 10, Dope Sick. So next we'll get into my number 9, which is Black Mirror. So this was the show I was referring to that was still ongoing. I believe the only one on my list which is still ongoing. But it's an anthology show, and so I feel like I can judge it as it is so far. Now, Black Mirror, I think, is probably the best sci-fi anthology show of all time. Like it better than even The Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits, neither of which made my list. Because I think the stories are typically really dark and ironic, but it seems more like less of a gotcha than those other episodes were, and more of true to real life character stories. And of course, it's a very cynical look of the use of technology. So it's more of this. A lot of people say it's a cynical look at technology, but the creators clarify it's actually a cynical look at humanity and how they use these technologies, and the way it relates to modern day technology having to do with smartphones, internets, and the trend where we're actually going is something that's hasn't really been done in sci-fi before, and I think this is the best use of it. Now, every season has its down episodes. Usually each season has like 2 great episodes, 2 mediocre episodes, and 2 shitty episodes. That's usually the format. I mean, there's some exceptions, there's some shorter seasons, but that's typically where it goes. So it's not like every single episode is a masterpiece, but I think there's enough masterpieces in there, and even and there's not, there's that pig fucking episode which I absolutely hated, but other than that, there's not really that many episodes that are that terrible. And so I think, that's what elevates this and pushes this all the way up to my number 9. So next we'll get into my number 8, which is Maniac. This is another limited series show, and I think this one, if I were going to call this a movie, this would be in my list of favorite movies of all time. It would probably make my top 10, although it's not a movie, as I said, so it does make my top 10 of shows, because I think the quirkiness of this show was extremely unique, and I just love the way I love mind-bendy, mind-twisty things, and I think this is some of the best sort of mind-bendy, mind-twisty things. It also deals, of course, with mental illness, which is a very interesting issue for me, and it does it in a very sort of detailed, intricate way. I think the characters played by Jonah Hill and Emma Stone were absolutely amazing. I think this is my favorite thing that Emma Stone has ever been in, and definitely my favorite thing Jonah Hill has been in, and I think the comedy in it is just so quirky and just works so well, but it works in conjunction with this great sort of mind-bendy psychological exploration of these characters, which I just think is amazing. So that is my number 8. So next we will get into my number 7, which is Better Call Saul. So this was a really great show with a great ending that told us the show as a whole told us, the story of Saul Goodman, aka Jimmy McGill, and it was almost a perfect character story. From getting, the more we meet this character, the more we see there is to him, the more we get his background. But it was mainly a downfall for him becoming this lovable character who just wants to do right by his brother, and has this true romance with Kim. But then as slowly starts to go downhill, and slowly things start to fall apart, and slowly he starts to, become a worse person, leading to an ending which I will not spoil, which is completely satisfying. But I will say, so I was thinking about having this higher in my list, but what did hold this show back a bit is it was really slow paced. At most of the time that wasn't a bad thing, but sometimes it was. I think particularly when it comes to the first 3 seasons, which I think could have easily been condensed into 2 seasons. But other than that, the slow storytelling actually really worked for the show, and helped sort of this great character exploration with all these amazing characters, not just Jimmy McGill and all these amazing actors, not just Bob Odenkirk, to just tell an amazing, I think probably the best prequel there ever was, Better Call Saul. So next we'll get to my number 6, which is Star Trek The Next Generation. Of course, a huge Star Trek fan. I'm going to have this high on my list. But Next Generation was a hard show to judge because it was very inconsistent in quality. It had 176 episodes. So it has to dip from time to time. So I do have to be, lenient with that and take that into account. But what did hold this show back from being in my top 3, because I did consider putting it in my top 3, but what held it back was the first 2 seasons, which were not good. And I definitely include season 2 in there. I disagree with those who don't. I think, the first 2 seasons were very cheesy and featured a lot of bad storytelling. Now, season 3, got so much better. It was so amazing. Season 4 kept a high quality. Season 5 kind of meandered a bit, and season 6 was a lot of amazing episodes, but some bad episodes at the start. And season 7, I think, is actually much better than a lot of people give it credit for. I think it's very dark and haunting, but of course not as good as some of the earlier seasons. But still, I think Next Generation, as I said, the highs were so high in this. The best thing, of course, was the core group of characters: Jean-Luc Picard, Data, Riker, the chemistry they had. It was very, fascinating, interesting seeing them go in different adventures and seeing all the different storytelling opportunities that they took full advantage of using these characters and this fantastical situation. I think leads to one of the best shows ever made, and is what made me a huge Star Trek fan. So that is number 6 on my list. So next we'll get into number 5 on my list, which is BoJack Horseman. Yes, I do have to have BoJack Horseman this high on my list, even though it is a comedy show. The first 2 seasons are very silly. I think it's some of the best comedy I've seen. But if you notice, I haven't really had many comedy shows on my list, because I don't really... Most, like sitcoms, for example, there are some sitcoms I really like Seinfeld, and I like The Simpsons, and News Radio is an underrated one from the 90s. But when I look at those shows, what I really like about them is that they're funny. And that's pretty much all there is to them, that they're funny. I mean, it's good funny. They're brilliant comedy writing, don't get me wrong. But in order to be considered one of my 20 best, it has to be more than just good comedy. It has to have good storytelling, good acting, good, something deeper meanings. And that's what BoJack Horseman has. And not only is it funny, it's got very interesting, very some of the deepest, darkest character explorations of any show, comedy or not, ever made. And even though it is animated with, animals, anthropomorphized animals, it still is so relatable to reality, and that in some ways is even more impressive, how it delves into very complex issues having to do with happiness and depression, in ways that some of the better ways that I think a lot of shows haven't been able to handle. But its high highs were absolutely amazing. It has some of the darkest, most emotionally affecting episodes I've seen on any show ever. So that is my number 5, BoJack Horseman. So coming in at number 4, and I'll get delving deep into my top 5 now. Number 4, The Leftovers. Yeah, this is made it higher than Lost and higher than The Watchmen. This is my favorite Lindelof show. I think it's the most consistently good. The first season was very, very dark and sometimes a bit dreary to get through. And so maybe it's my least favorite, actually. But the second season is definitely my favorite, even though there's one episode in there is terrible and some aspects of another episode that aren't so good. So it does have some low lows in that season, but it's still my favorite season because it just takes this premise and really explodes it and go in directions I did not expect them to do. Like the character explorations were always there from the beginning, and dealing with the loss of having lost so many people and how this affects people, but the way they delve into the psychological characters through these fantastical situations in season 2 I thought was absolutely amazing. Now I did like season 3, maybe not as much as season 2, but still an amazing season of television. I think the penultimate episode of the show was a masterpiece, like a pure masterpiece. The final episode was good, wasn't bad, but maybe not as good as maybe I'd hope it would be. It was more like an epilogue in some ways, but still, the way it ties up the entire story of the show was definitely impressive, and I think the show remained true to its core and remained of high quality. So that is all the way up at my number 4, The Leftovers. So then coming in at number 3 is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Gotta stay true to my Trekkie fandom, my love of Star Trek, and Deep Space Nine definitely had some lows, for sure. I did a top 30 worst episodes of Star Trek, and it has some of the worst episodes in the entire franchise. Looking at you, Prophet and Lace, and looking at you, Vic Fontaine. But despite its low lows, it's still, I think, one of the best shows ever made, mainly for its, again, group of characters that were very interesting to follow. But what I like most about Star Trek, what makes me a Star Trek fan, is not seeing a group of cadets flying out into space, going on adventures. That's really not what attracts me to Star Trek. What attracts me to Star Trek is the world building, the seeing the universe building, the creating this tangible world. There's these Klingons, the Romulans, Cardassians. What does the psychological effects these societies have? It's like, it is more of, it's character building, but not just with individual characters, with societies, with dealing with social issues and ways that only fantastical shows can do. And I think Deep Space Nine is the Star Trek show that takes most advantage of this, that makes the most sort of poignant allegories and explorations of what exactly some of these social issues means, while at the same time getting into all these interesting characters and interesting dynamics that you really you couldn't find on a show that's just confined to a Starfleet ship. It really plays with shady characters like Garrick, who's some of the best characters from the other show. Villains like Gul Dukat is easily the best villain of the entire franchise. So yeah, this comes all the way at number 3. Deep Space Nine, the first two seasons were mediocre. The third season I thought was amazing. The fourth season was good, but they had this Klingon storyline that was unnecessary. The fifth season kind of stepped down, kind of a bit mediocre. Season 6, very hit or miss, but when it hit hard. Some of the best storytellings ever. And then season 7, first half was mediocre, second half was amazing. So, yes, Deep Space Nine comes in at number 3 for me. So then, getting into my top 2 now. My number 2 second favorite show of all time, Breaking Bad. Now, Breaking Bad, gotta put it this high, has a singular character story of Walter White and his character journey is probably the best ever done. But all the different other characters that he encounters through the way, through his slide into becoming a very sort of his downfall, is the downfall of the criminal type, and how he's originally he was just like someone with cancer who wanted to provide money for his family, but it became more than that. He became lustful for the power, and it's a really American story too, not just because it deals with the faulty healthcare system, but the need for intertwining one's ego and one's vanity within the possessions of acquiring money and power. And the way it explores it is absolutely amazing. It's as I said before, it gets better with every season. Each season is better than the next, leading to the best final season of any show ever that was so satisfying. Now, almost made my number 1, but what held us back from my number 1 was was a bit too slow at times, particularly in those first 2 seasons, those first 3 seasons actually, but particularly season 2, which had this ridiculous storyline with the plane crash that they really should have done without. It really went into its own in its final seasons, and if I was just judging this show by its final 2 seasons, it probably would hit my number 1. I think when I did do my season thing, season 5 did hit number 1, but looking at the show as a whole, it makes it all the way up to number 2 though. Is my number 2 second favorite show of all time, Breaking Bad. So, getting up to my number 1 favorite show of all time. This is a show I think a lot of people will disagree with. Some people will be surprised with. I was actually surprised. I didn't expect this to hit my number 1, but when I was judging the show as a whole and looking at all the faults and all the strengths and all the weaknesses and looking at the entire thing, I came up with my number 1, The Expanse. Now, some people wouldn't be that surprised because this is always at the top of my list. I do really, really love this show, and I think this is the most consistently good with the highest highs as well. The Expanse was, again, a dark, gritty sci-fi that had the allegory of real life and dealing with properties, but it does it in a much more out there and in your face way than Star Trek ever did, and not too in your face like Battlestar Galactica, where it becomes a bit pretentious and too showy, where here it felt just real and gritty. And I particularly love all the characters they introduced, similar to Game of Thrones. We follow different characters and different sides, which really fleshes out the world building. But I will say this hit my number 1 because I don't think the show ever really dips like some of these other shows, like even Breaking Bad. As I said, it was kind of too slow in the first couple of seasons, whereas The Expanse, like every show, has its low points. It's not a perfect show. I don't think there's any such thing as one, but there's no season I would point to and say that is a bad season. Season 1 would probably be my least favorite, mainly because it was a bit too confusing for the new viewer just getting into it, and it sort of took until episode 6 to really hit its stride, although there were some really great moments even before episode 6, like the whole battle in the Dollinger, which was amazing. And in season 2, one of my favorite seasons of all time, even though it does have a few low points, a few boring episodes where it meanders a bit, it's still such an amazing season that has one of my favorite episodes of all time, when they encounter the Eros is taken over by a proto-molecule and is hurled at Earth. Absolutely amazing. So the best, some of that was like, if that was a movie, that would be like one of my favorite movies of all time. And then continuing on with the story of Bobby Draper and the complex political intrigue, just such a good job, even in that second half of season 2. Now, season 3, I think it does dip a bit because it doesn't handle the third book, which is my favorite book in the book series. It's not a very good adaptation. It chops it up too quickly, and we speed through the storyline, and we miss some great characters, like Clarissa's development, which was so amazing in the books and actually done very poorly in the show. But that being said, I still love season 3. There's still some of the best episodes of the entire shows in that season. It's still overall, like, the encountering the resolution to the Earth and Mars conflict was very satisfying, very intense with those freaking proto-molecule hybrids being shot to Mars and then having to stop them. And then the second half, even though I do think they sped through book 3 too much, still had some amazing moments, still had some great storytelling, such as holding, encountering the vision, and then some things the show does better than the books, even within that season. So I still love season 3. Season 4 I actually thought was an improvement of the book, although the fourth book was my least favorite book, but they did a better job of it. The way they portrayed it on screen was so much better, and the story itself wasn't that great, and so it's still not the best season ever, but they still elevated the stories and they really hit its stride, and they really got into the writing groove. Now season 5 and 6 I think get a lot of undue hate. I think they're way better than a lot of people give them credit for. I freaking love these seasons. I think they were a few low points in them, but I still think the story of Marco and Ars was immensely intense, and I absolutely love the way they played out in season 5 and 6. And I think the ending of the show, even though it did end prematurely because there's still 3 books left, the ending of the show was one of the best endings of any show ever, and I think was absolutely satisfying. Stayed totally true to the show. Was a great resolution. It's very rare for a show to end in such a satisfying way. Like, there's a few examples on my list, such as Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, that does manage to do that. But I think The Expanse just remained consistently good throughout all of it, and so I'm actually surprised. But when I look back at it, as I said, maybe I'll change my mind a year from now. Maybe I'll have The Expanse at number 5 or something. I don't know. But right now, using my best judgment, this is my number 1, The Expanse. So that is it for my top 20 favorite shows of all time. Jeez, not an easy list to put together at all. But I do want to thank my patrons for supporting me on Patreon, particularly Ricky for suggesting this video. Thank you so much for that. And of course, big shout out to the rest of my Patreon supporters. We have Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Brian A., Alessandro Miglicio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neil Howells. Thank you all so very much for your support, and if you would like to support me on Patreon, $1 a month will get you access to pre-releases and Patreon-only videos. And if you would like to donate $10 or more, you can request videos like this one. So thank you so much for your support, and thanks everyone for watching. Be sure to subscribe, leave a like if you could, and check out my channel as I cover many other shows, doing Star Trek the original series at the moment and Star Trek Picard, and cover many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.